Before we begin, please note that today's story contains discussions of child abuse and psychological manipulation. Viewer discretion is advised. If you or someone you know needs help, resources are available in the description below. It was supposed to be the house where childhood dreams came true, until someone noticed that every mirror was nailed to the wall. The Hallowick estate stood like a monument to prosperity on Willowbrook Lane, its Victorian towers casting long shadows across manicured lawns. From the outside, it looked like something from a fairy tale: white picket fences, rose gardens, and the sound of children's laughter drifting through open windows. But fairy tales, as we know, often hide the darkest truths. Between 1987 and 1994, Margaret and Harold Hallowick opened their doors to 17 children. 17 souls who needed homes, who needed love, who needed protection. The state called them model foster parents. The community called them saints. The children learned never to look directly at their own reflections. What started as whispered concerns from neighbors about the strange silence that would fall over the house at dusk became an investigation that would shake the very foundations of a small Pennsylvania town. Because sometimes the most horrifying prisons aren't built with bars and concrete. Sometimes they're built with family photographs, home-cooked meals, and mirrors that reflect everything except the truth. This is the story of how a house full of love became a house full of ghosts. How 17 children learned to fear their own faces. And how an entire community discovered that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding under beds. They're the ones tucking children into them. What happened in that house on Willowbrook Lane wasn't just abuse. It was psychological warfare waged against the most vulnerable minds, using tools as simple as glass and as complex as human trust. And when the truth finally came to light, it would reveal a method of control so insidious, so deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life, that some of those children would never again feel safe looking at themselves. Welcome back to the Creepy Journal, where truth is often stranger than fiction, and sometimes far more terrifying. This one hit me harder than most. Maybe because it feels too possible. Maybe because it happened in a place that looked exactly like the homes we drive past every day, in a town that could be anywhere in America. The Hallowick case isn't just about what happened behind closed doors. It's about how those doors can hide in plain sight, decorated with welcome mats and flower boxes. I've spent months researching this case, reading court documents, interviewing former neighbors, and yes, even visiting that house on Willowbrook Lane. What I discovered was a story that goes far deeper than the headlines suggested. A story about mirrors, about identity, about the particular kind of hell that can exist in a place that everyone else calls paradise. So settle in, because this journey is going to take us to some very dark places. And if you're ready to walk through more doors that should have stayed closed, subscribe to the Creepy Journal so you never miss a page from our dark journal. Because some stories demand to be told, no matter how much they disturb our sleep. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was a place where the American dream felt tangible, where white picket fences weren't just decoration but promises of safety and belonging. The town square hosted farmers' markets on Saturdays. The local diner served coffee that actually tasted like community, and the biggest scandal in recent memory had been when the mayor's wife planted roses in a color that didn't match the town's aesthetic guidelines. This was the world where Margaret and Harold Hallowick built their empire of kindness. They arrived in 1985, A childless couple in their early 40s with deep pockets and even deeper hearts, or so everyone believed. Harold was a retired insurance executive. Margaret, a former social worker who spoke passionately about giving children the childhood they deserved. They purchased the old Victorian mansion on Willowbrook Lane, a house that had sat empty for 3 years after the previous owners moved to Florida. The renovation took 2 years and cost more than most people in Millbrook made in a decade. Margaret supervised every detail personally, from the hand-carved banisters to the imported Italian tiles in the bathrooms. She had a vision, she told the contractors, of creating a home where children could heal from whatever trauma had brought them into the foster care system. The house would have 7 bedrooms, each decorated with a different theme: fairy tales, outer space, enchanted forests, underwater kingdoms. Every room would have its own bathroom, its own mirror, its own sense of special identity. Margaret had this way of talking about the children like they were treasures, recalled Betty Morehouse, who lived across the street. She'd say things like every child deserves to see themselves as magical, and a child's reflection should show them their worth. It all sounded so beautiful. We thought we were watching angels at work. The first children arrived in spring of 1987, 3 siblings, aged 6, 8, and 10, who had been removed from a home where neglect was the kindest word for what they'd endured. The transformation was immediate and remarkable. The children, who had arrived silent and withdrawn, began laughing within weeks. They played in the backyard, helped Margaret with her garden, and seemed to blossom under the Hallowicks' care. Those kids went from looking like scared rabbits to acting like any normal children, remembered Tom Garrett, who delivered their mail. You'd see them running around the yard, playing games, acting like kids should act. Harold would be out. They're teaching them baseball. Margaret would have them helping with the flowers. It looked like a Norman Rockwell painting. The neighbors noticed other things too. The house always smelled like fresh bread and vanilla candles. The children's clothes were always clean and well-fitted. They attended St. Mary's Catholic Church every Sunday, sitting in the 3rd pew, hands folded, angelic faces turned toward the altar. Margaret volunteered for every church function, and Harold coached Little League baseball. They were, by every measure that mattered to Millbrook, the perfect family. But perfection, like mirrors, can be deceptive. It reflects what we want to see, not necessarily what is. By 1989, the Hallowicks were caring for 8 children. By 1991, 12. By 1993, they had been approved for their 17th placement, a record that made them celebrities in social services circles. Margaret gave speeches at conferences about their methods. Harold wrote articles for foster care journals. They were invited to consultation meetings with state officials who wanted to understand their secret. The secret, they claimed, was simple: love unconditionally, set clear boundaries, and help each child develop a strong sense of self-worth. We want every child to love who they see in the mirror, Margaret would say in her presentations. Self-love is the foundation of all healing. Irony of those words would later become apparent. But at the time, they sounded like wisdom. They sounded like hope. They sounded like the kind of philosophy that could change the world. One child at a time. The house on Willowbrook Lane became a destination for social workers, a model for other foster families, and a source of pride for the entire community. Local newspapers ran feature stories about the Hallowicks' success. The mayor presented them with a key to the city. The state of Pennsylvania gave them their highest honor for foster care excellence. But no one could explain why the children never seemed to look directly at anything when they spoke. No one could explain why they all had the same hesitant way of moving through space, as if they were afraid of casting shadows. And no one could explain why, despite all the love and care lavished upon them, these children never seemed to truly see themselves as magical. First red flags appear. 800 to 1,000 words, the first crack in the perfect facade, appeared on a Tuesday morning in October 1992, though it would be years before anyone recognized it as such. Sister Catherine O'Brien, the principal at St. Mary's Elementary School, noticed something odd about the Hallowick children during the school's annual photo day. They wouldn't look at the camera, she recalled years later during depositions. Not directly. They'd look just to the left or right of the lens, like they were afraid to make eye contact with their own image. When I tried to adjust their positioning, they became visibly distressed. One of the younger ones, Sarah, actually started crying when I moved her to face the camera directly. The photographer, a patient man who had been taking school pictures for over 20 years, spent nearly an hour trying to get proper shots of the 7 Hallowick children who attended St. Mary's. In the end, he gave up and took the photos as they were children with beautiful clothes, perfect posture, and eyes that seemed to be looking at something just beyond the frame. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the school's guidance counselor, began keeping informal notes about the Hallowick children after the photo incident. What she documented was a pattern of behavior that was unusual, though not necessarily alarming. The children were polite to a fault, never spoke out of turn, and showed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate what adults wanted from them. They excelled academically, participated in extracurricular activities when asked, and never, ever caused trouble. They were like perfectly programmed little robots, Dr. Walsh wrote in her notes, but robots designed to mimic happiness rather than actually experience it. They laughed at appropriate times, smiled when expected, and said all the right things. But there was something hollow about it, like they were performing childhood rather than living it. The most disturbing observation came from the school's art teacher, Mrs. Patricia Hendricks. During a self-portrait assignment, the Hallowick children produced drawings that were technically proficient but emotionally vacant. Every self-portrait they created showed a figure with features that were deliberately obscured, faces turned away, eyes closed, or hands covering their faces. When I asked them to draw themselves looking in a mirror, they became agitated, Mrs. Hendricks reported. One child asked if they could draw themselves from behind instead. Another asked if they could draw a mirror that was broken. When I insisted, they draw themselves as they would see themselves in a mirror. Several of them had what I can only describe as panic attacks. The school's concerns might have remained academic if not for an incident that occurred during a routine visit from the county social worker. Jessica Martinez had been conducting her quarterly check-ins with the Hallowick family for 3 years, and her reports were consistently glowing. The children were thriving, the home was immaculate, and the family dynamics appeared healthy and loving. But on this particular visit in January 1993, something felt different. Ms. Martinez couldn't quite put her finger on what had changed, but the atmosphere in the house seemed more controlled than usual. The children, who typically greeted her with enthusiasm, seemed almost mechanical in their responses. I asked to speak with each child individually, which was standard procedure, Ms. Martinez later testified. But when I took the first child, Tommy, aged 9, to his bedroom for our private conversation, I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. Every mirror in the house, and there were many, was nailed directly to the wall. Not hung on hooks or mounted with brackets, but nailed with large, obvious nails driven through the glass itself at each corner. When Ms. Martinez asked Tommy about the mirrors, his response was immediate and rehearsed. Mirrors need to be secure so they don't fall and hurt anyone. Safety is very important in our house. The explanation made logical sense, but something about Tommy's delivery, the way he recited it like a memorized speech, raised red flags. Ms. Martinez made a mental note to ask Margaret about the mirrors during their wrap-up conversation. Margaret's explanation was characteristically thoughtful and reasonable. We found that children from traumatic backgrounds often have complicated relationships with their own reflection, she said. By securing the mirrors permanently, we remove the temptation for them to avoid looking at themselves, or conversely, to become obsessed with their appearance. It's a therapeutic technique we developed based on our experience with self-esteem issues. The explanation satisfied Ms. Martinez at the time. Margaret always had answers that sounded professional and caring. But later, when she reviewed her notes, she realized that Margaret had never actually answered the core question. Why were the mirrors nailed through the glass rather than mounted properly? That night, Miss Martinez called her supervisor to discuss her vague concerns. The conversation was brief and inconclusive. The Hallowick family had an exemplary record. The children appeared healthy and well cared for, and there was no evidence of abuse or neglect. Her supervisor advised her to document her observations but take no immediate action. The documentation would prove crucial years later, but at the time, it was just another report in a file cabinet. Another small concern that was outweighed by the overwhelming evidence of a successful foster family. The children continued to attend school, participate in community activities, and present the image of a happy, healthy family. But teachers began to notice that they never volunteered to clean the classroom mirrors, never looked at themselves in the bathroom mirrors, and showed signs of distress whenever their reflection appeared unexpectedly in windows or glass doors. First crack in the Hallowick family's perfect facade became a fissure on a humid Sunday morning in June 1994. It was Children's Day at St. Mary's Catholic Church, and the Hallowick family occupied their usual pew, third row, center aisle. 17 children arranged by height like a living organ pipe. Margaret sat at one end, Harold at the other, both beaming with parental pride as their foster children sang hymns with angelic voices. The service was proceeding normally, until Father Michael O'Connell invited the children to come forward for the blessing of the young. It was a tradition the Hallowick children had participated in dozens of times before, walking to the altar with quiet dignity, receiving the priest's blessing, and returning to their seats with downcast eyes and folded hands. But this time, something went wrong. 10-year-old Rebecca Chen, who had been with the family for 3 years, approached the altar as usual. But as she knelt before Father O'Connell, she caught sight of her reflection in the polished gold surface of the chalice. The reaction was immediate and devastating. She let out a scream that I'll never forget, recalled parishioner Martha Williamson. It wasn't the sound of a child who was startled or scared. It was the sound of someone who had seen something absolutely terrifying. She started clawing at her face, actually clawing at it like she was trying to remove her own skin. The other Hallowick children froze in their seats, their faces draining of color. 2 of the younger ones began to hyperventilate. The oldest, 16-year-old Michael, stood up as if to help Rebecca, but then seemed to catch himself and sat back down, his hands trembling visibly. Margaret moved with practiced efficiency, reaching Rebecca in seconds and wrapping her in what appeared to be a comforting embrace. but several witnesses noticed that Margaret's grip seemed more restraining than comforting, and her whispered words to Rebecca were too quiet for anyone to hear. "Take her to the bathroom," Margaret instructed Harold, who had appeared at her side. "She just needs some air." Father O'Connell, a man who had officiated at countless family crises, tried to continue the service, but the damage was done. The congregation was visibly shaken, and the remaining Hallowick children seemed to shrink into themselves with each passing moment. Dr. Amanda Stevens, a pediatrician who attended St. Mary's, couldn't shake what she had witnessed. Rebecca's reaction wasn't just unusual, it was pathological. As a medical professional, she recognized the signs of severe psychological trauma, but she had never seen a child react to their own reflection with such visceral terror. After the service, Dr. Stevens approached Margaret with professional concern. "Is Rebecca all right?" That was quite a reaction she had. Margaret's response was smooth and immediate. "Rebecca has been struggling with some self-esteem issues lately. She's at that age where children become very self-conscious about their appearance. We've been working with her on building confidence, but sometimes these things take time." The explanation was reasonable, but Dr. Stevens noticed that Margaret never actually answered whether Rebecca was all right. She also noticed that the other Hallowick children seemed to be listening intently to the conversation, as if they were waiting for specific words or phrases. That evening, Dr. Stevens called her colleague, Dr. Richard Hayes, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma cases. She described what she had witnessed and asked for his professional opinion. "A child having a panic attack triggered by their own reflection is extremely concerning," Dr. Hayes told her. "That level of self-directed fear usually indicates severe abuse or psychological conditioning. I'd recommend reporting this to Child Protective Services immediately." But Dr. Stevens hesitated. The Hallowicks were pillars of the community. Margaret was a former social worker herself. The family had been investigated numerous times over the years as part of routine foster care oversight, and every report had been glowing. Who would believe that such a respected family could be involved in abuse? The decision was made for her 2 days later, when Rebecca Chen appeared at school with what appeared to be self-inflicted scratches on her face and arms. When asked about the injuries by her teacher, Rebecca's response was immediate and rehearsed. "I had a bad dream and scratched myself in my sleep. It happens sometimes. I'm seeing a doctor about it." The teacher, Mrs. Gloria Phelps, wasn't satisfied with the explanation. She had taught children for 23 years and had never seen self-inflicted scratches that deep and deliberate. She immediately reported the incident to the school's principal, who was required by law to contact Child Protective Services. The investigation that followed was cursory and inconclusive. The social worker who visited the Hallowick home found clean, well-dressed children in an immaculate house. Rebecca's injuries were documented but explained away as the result of a sleep disorder that the family was already addressing with medical professionals. Margaret provided documentation from a psychiatrist who had diagnosed Rebecca with adjustment disorder with anxiety and prescribed a mild sedative to help her sleep. Everything appeared to be in order. The case was closed within 2 weeks. But the incident had attracted attention from an unexpected source. Janet Morrison, a freelance journalist who lived in the neighboring town of Riverside, had been in the congregation at St. Mary's that Sunday morning. She had witnessed Rebecca's breakdown and been disturbed by the family's strangely controlled response. Morrison had spent 15 years investigating stories that other journalists wouldn't touch. Cases of institutional abuse, government cover-ups, and systemic failures that harmed vulnerable populations. Something about the Hallowick incident reminded her of other cases she had covered. Cases where the most horrific abuse had been hidden behind facades of respectability and community approval. She began what she called her curiosity research. Informal inquiries that weren't quite investigations, but weren't quite casual interest either. She spoke with teachers, neighbors, and church members, asking seemingly innocent questions about the remarkable Hallowick family. What she discovered was a pattern of small inconsistencies that might have been meaningless individually but formed a troubling picture when viewed together. The children's strange relationship with mirrors and reflective surfaces, their robotic responses to questions, their lack of normal childhood spontaneity, their apparent inability to make direct eye contact with cameras or their own reflections. Most disturbing of all, she discovered that several former Hallowick foster children had been moved to other placements over the years, always at the request of the children themselves, always with explanations that sounded reasonable, but never quite satisfied the social workers involved. Morrison decided to dig deeper. She had no idea that her investigation would eventually uncover one of the most insidious cases of psychological abuse in Pennsylvania's history. Janet. Morrison's investigation began with a simple question. Where were the children who had left? The Hallowick home, foster care records are confidential, but Morrison had spent years cultivating sources within the social services system. Through a combination of public records, requests, court filings, and careful conversations with former caseworkers, she began to piece together a pattern that was both disturbing and elusive. Between 1987 and 1994, 23 children had been placed with the Hallowick family. 17 were currently in the home. 6 had been moved to other placements. The official reasons for these moves were varied but always reasonable. Behavioral problems that required specialized care, requests for placement closer to biological family members, or simple incompatibility with the family dynamic. But when Morrison managed to track down 3 of the former Hallowick children, now adults, their stories painted a very different picture. David Kowalski, now 24 and living in Philadelphia, had been placed with the Hallowicks when he was 12 years old. He agreed to meet Morrison at a coffee shop in Center City, far from Millbrook and the memories that still haunted him. "I can't look at mirrors," he told her without preamble. "I mean, I can look at them, but not at myself in them. I shave by touch, brush my teeth with my eyes closed, avoid public restrooms that have mirrors. I've been in therapy for 8 years, and I still can't explain why." David's account of his 18 months with the Hallowicks was fragmented and difficult to follow. He described a home that was indeed loving and nurturing during the day, but transformed into something else entirely after dark. He spoke of mirror time, periods when the children were required to stand in front of their nailed-down mirrors and recite what Margaret called truth statements about themselves. She would make us say things like, "I am broken and I am lucky anyone wants me and I deserve to be alone," David recalled. But the worst part was that she would make us say it while looking at ourselves in the mirror. And if we looked away, even for a second, we had to start over. Some nights, we'd stand there for hours. The second former resident Morrison interviewed was Linda Marchetti, now 19 and working as a waitress in Pittsburgh. Linda had been with the Hallowicks for 2 years before requesting a transfer to a different placement. "Everyone thought I was crazy for wanting to leave," Linda said. "The social workers, the judge, even the other kids in the system. The Hallowicks were like winning the lottery, a beautiful home, plenty of food, nice clothes, good schools. But there was something wrong with that house. something that made you feel like you were disappearing. Linda's account was more detailed than David's. She described elaborate reflection therapy, sessions where Margaret would force the children to confront what she called their true selves in the mirror. These sessions, Linda explained, were designed to break down the children's self-esteem and rebuild it according to Margaret's specifications. She would tell us that we were fundamentally flawed, that we came from bad families because we were bad people, that we were lucky she was willing to work with such damaged goods, Linda recalled. And she would make us repeat these things back to ourselves while looking in the mirror. She said it was the only way to accept reality and move forward. The third former resident Morrison interviewed was Marcus Thompson, now 21 and serving in the military. Marcus had been with the Hallowicks for only 6 months before what his file called a behavioral incident resulted in his removal. From the home, I tried to break one of the mirrors, Marcus admitted. I couldn't stand looking at myself anymore, couldn't stand hearing my own voice say those things about myself. So I punched the mirror in my room. But it didn't break. It was some kind of reinforced glass. All I did was split my knuckles open and prove to Margaret that I was as violent and unstable as she said I was. The picture that emerged from these interviews was of a sophisticated system of psychological abuse disguised as therapy. Margaret, with her background in social work, had apparently developed a method of systematically destroying children's self-esteem and rebuilding their self-concept. According to her own design, the mirrors weren't just decoration, they were tools of torture. By forcing children to confront their reflections while reciting negative statements about themselves, Margaret was creating a classical conditioning response that associated self-perception with shame, fear, and disgust. Morrison's investigation took a significant turn when she discovered that Margaret had been developing what she called reflection therapy for years before becoming a foster parent. Through academic database searches, Morrison found that Margaret had written her master's thesis on mirror-based interventions in child psychology and had published several papers on the therapeutic use of self-reflection in treating oppositional, defiant disorder in foster children. The papers were academically rigorous and theoretically sound, but they described techniques that bordered on psychological torture. Margaret advocated for what she called intensive self-confrontation as a method of forcing children to accept responsibility for their circumstances and develop realistic self-perception. Morrison also discovered that Margaret had been consulting with other foster families and residential treatment facilities, sharing her methods and training other caregivers in reflection therapy techniques. The implications were staggering. If Margaret's methods were being used elsewhere, there could be dozens or even hundreds of children being subjected to similar abuse. The investigation took another disturbing turn when Morrison examined the physical evidence. She obtained photographs of the Hallowick home from real estate listings, social service visits, and newspaper articles. Every mirror in the house was indeed nailed to the wall with large, obvious nails driven through the glass at each corner. But Morrison noticed something else in the photographs that she initially dismissed as a reflection artifact. In several images, the mirrors appeared to show distorted reflections, images that seemed stretched, warped, or otherwise altered. When she had the photographs analyzed by a forensic imaging expert, the results were disturbing. These aren't regular mirrors, the expert explained. They appear to be funhouse mirrors, the kind designed to distort reflection. Some make people look shorter and wider, others make them look stretched and thin. The distortion is subtle, but it's definitely there. The implications were chilling. Margaret hadn't just been forcing children to confront their reflections while reciting negative statements about themselves. She had been forcing them to do so while looking at deliberately distorted images that made them appear physically deformed or grotesque. Morrison's investigation was gaining momentum, but she knew she needed more than the testimony of former residents and academic papers. She needed current evidence, documentation of ongoing abuse, and most importantly, she needed to find a way to help the 17 children who were still living in the house on Willowbrook Lane. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Richard Hayes, the child psychologist who had originally suggested that Rebecca Chen's reaction to her reflection was indicative of severe psychological trauma, contacted Morrison after hearing about her investigation through mutual acquaintances. "I've been thinking about that case for months," he told her, "and I've been reviewing the literature on forced self-confrontation as a form of psychological abuse. If what you're describing is accurate, those children are being subjected to a form of torture that's specifically designed to destroy their sense of self-worth and personal identity." Dr. Hayes agreed to review Morrison's findings and provide expert analysis of the techniques Margaret was apparently using. His report, which would later become crucial evidence in the criminal case, concluded that reflection therapy, as practiced by Margaret Hallowick, constituted severe psychological abuse that could cause permanent damage to a child's sense of self and ability to form healthy relationships. Morrison now had expert testimony, witness accounts, and physical evidence. But she still needed a way to get inside the house on Willowbrook Lane and document what was happening to the children who were still trapped there. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a fire inspection. In November 1994, the Millbrook Fire Department was conducting routine safety inspections of all residential properties that housed more than 10 people. The Hallowick home, with its 17 foster children, clearly qualified for the inspection. Fire Chief Robert Martinez, no relation to the social worker, scheduled the visit for a Tuesday afternoon, when the children would be at school and the inspection could be conducted without disruption. Janet Morrison had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Through her network of sources, she learned about the inspection date and convinced Chief Martinez to allow her to accompany the inspection team as a freelancer journalist, writing a story about fire safety in large residential homes. What they found inside the Hallowick house would haunt the inspection team for the rest of their lives. The first floor appeared exactly as everyone expected: immaculate, beautifully decorated, with family photographs covering every surface and the lingering scent of fresh-baked cookies in the air. The mirrors on the first floor were the decorative, distorted ones Morrison had identified in photographs, but they seemed almost benign in the context of the home's overall warmth and comfort. The second floor housed the children's bedrooms, each one individually decorated and apparently designed with love and attention to detail. But it was here that the inspection team first noticed the true extent of the mirror installation. Every bedroom had multiple mirrors, not just the one over the dresser, but mirrors mounted on the walls, the ceiling, even the inside of the closet doors. All of them were nailed to their surfaces with large, obvious nails driven through the glass. "I've never seen anything like it," Chief Martinez would later testify. There were mirrors everywhere, and they were all secured like they were afraid someone would try to remove them. It didn't make sense from a safety standpoint. All those nails through glass actually made the mirrors more dangerous, not less. But it was the third floor that revealed the true horror of what had been happening in the house on Willowbrook Lane. The third floor had been converted into what Margaret called reflection therapy rooms. There were 3 separate chambers, each one designed for a specific type of psychological conditioning. The first room was lined entirely with mirrors, walls, ceiling, floor, all of them slightly distorted to create a disorienting funhouse effect. The second room contained a single chair facing a massive mirror that was illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. The third room was the most disturbing of all. It was like a sensory deprivation chamber, Morrison wrote in her notes. The walls were painted black. There were no windows, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging directly over a chair. But the chair was positioned so that when you sat in it, you were facing 3 mirrors arranged in a triangle. The mirrors were angled so that you could see infinite reflections of yourself stretching away in all directions. The inspection team also discovered audio recording equipment in each room, along with detailed logs of therapy sessions that documented the specific techniques used on each child. The logs, written in Margaret's precise handwriting, read like a manual for psychological torture. Subject 7, Rebecca, day 14 of intensive reflection therapy. Subject continued to resist self-confrontation exercises. Extended session to 4 hours. Subject broke down at 3.5 hours and began reciting assigned statements. Progress noted. Recommend continued intensive sessions until compliance becomes automatic. Subject 12, Michael, day 32 of reflection therapy. Subject showing signs of dissociation during mirror exercises. This is expected and indicates breakthrough is imminent. Increased session duration to 6 hours. Subject must learn to associate self-perception with shame and dependence. The logs documented years of systematic psychological abuse. Children were forced to spend hours staring at their distorted reflections while reciting statements designed to destroy their self-esteem. Those who resisted were subjected to longer sessions, food deprivation, and isolation. Those who complied were rewarded with normal family activities and privileges. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of videotapes that documented the therapy sessions. The tapes, which were later used as evidence in the criminal trial, showed children as young as 6 years old being forced to stand in front of mirrors while Margaret's voice, calm and patient, guided them through exercises designed to break down their sense of self-worth. "Look at yourself," Margaret's voice could be heard saying on one tape. "What do you see? Do you see someone who deserves love? Do you see someone who comes from a good family? Do you see someone who has value? No, you don't. You see someone who was thrown away by their real family because they weren't worth keeping." The children on the tapes were clearly in distress, but they had learned to hide their pain behind masks of compliance. They recited the statements Margaret required, stared at their reflections for hours at a time, and gradually began to internalize the messages they were being forced to repeat. Fire. Chief Martinez immediately contacted the police, who arrived at the house within 20 minutes. The children were still at school, but Harold was home and was taken into custody without incident. Margaret was arrested at her volunteer position at the local library, where she had been reading stories to preschoolers. The 17 children, currently in the Hallowick home, were immediately removed and placed in emergency foster care. The house was sealed as a crime scene, and a team of child psychologists was assembled to begin the long process of helping the children recover from years of systematic psychological abuse. Dr. Richard Hayes, who had been consulting with investigation, was part of the team that conducted initial interviews with the children. His report described the extent of the psychological damage. These children have been subjected to a form of abuse that is specifically designed to destroy their sense of self-worth and personal identity. They have been conditioned to associate self-perception with shame, fear, and disgust. Many of them are unable to look at their own reflections without experiencing severe anxiety attacks. Some have developed what appears to be a form of dissociative disorder, where they seem to mentally disconnect from their own image. The physical evidence collected from the house filled several police evidence rooms. In addition to the mirrors, recording equipment, and videotapes, investigators found detailed psychological profiles of each child, training materials for other caregivers, and correspondence with other institutions that had implemented Margaret's reflection therapy techniques. The investigation had uncovered not just a case of child abuse, but a systematic program of psychological torture that had been disguised as innovative therapeutic treatment. And the evidence suggested that the Hallowick house was just the beginning. Margaret's methods were being used in other locations, potentially affecting dozens or even hundreds of children. The trial of Margaret and Harold Hallowick began in September 1995 and lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented a case that was both compelling and heartbreaking, with expert testimony from child psychologists, forensic evidence from the house, and devastating testimony from former residents. Margaret Hallowick was convicted on 17 counts of child abuse, 17 counts of endangering the welfare of a child, and multiple counts of psychological torture, a charge that had been rarely used in Pennsylvania but was specifically applied to this case due to the systematic nature of the abuse. She was sentenced to 45 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Harold Hallowick was convicted on lesser charges of child endangerment and failure to report abuse. The prosecution argued that while he had not participated directly in the reflection therapy sessions, he had been aware of them and had failed to protect the children in his care. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The sentences were among the harshest ever handed down for child abuse in Pennsylvania, reflecting both the severity of the abuse and the systematic nature of the torture program that had been implemented. But the legal victory was only the beginning of the story. The 17 children who had been rescued from the Hallowick house faced a long and difficult road to recovery. Many of them required intensive therapy to address the psychological damage caused by years of systematic abuse. Several were hospitalized for severe anxiety disorders, depression, and what psychologists termed reflection-induced trauma syndrome. The youngest victims, who had been subjected to the abuse during their most formative years, showed the most severe symptoms. They had learned to associate their own reflection with shame and fear, making even basic daily activities like brushing teeth or combing hair extremely difficult. Specialized treatment facilities had to be developed to address their unique needs. Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist who worked with several of the survivors, described the challenge. These children had been systematically taught to hate themselves at the most fundamental level. They couldn't look at their own faces without experiencing panic attacks. Rebuilding their sense of self-worth required years of careful, patient work. The investigation also revealed that Margaret's reflection therapy techniques had been implemented at 4 other foster homes and 2 residential treatment facilities across Pennsylvania and New Jersey. In total, over 60 children had been subjected to various forms of the abuse. Additional arrests were made, and several institutions lost their licenses to operate. The state of Pennsylvania implemented new regulations for foster care facilities, including mandatory psychological evaluations for all caregivers and unannounced inspections of all homes housing more than 5 children. The Hallowick Protocol became a model for identifying and preventing systematic psychological abuse in residential care settings. The house on Willowbrook Lane was sold to a developer who demolished it in 1997. The lot remained empty for several years before a small park was built on the site. The park features a memorial garden dedicated to survivors of child abuse, though it makes no specific mention of the Hallowick case. Many of the survivors struggled with the transition to normal life. Some required years of therapy and multiple placement changes before finding stable, loving homes. Others aged out of the foster care system while still dealing with the psychological trauma of their experiences. However, there were also stories of remarkable resilience. Several survivors went on to become advocates for child welfare reform, using their experiences to help identify and prevent similar abuse. Linda Marchetti, one of the former residents who had helped expose the abuse, became a social worker specializing in trauma recovery. David Kowalski started a non-profit organization that provides specialized therapy for children who have experienced psychological abuse. The Hallowick case fundamentally changed how child protection agencies approach psychological abuse cases. It demonstrated that some of the most severe forms of child abuse could be disguised as legitimate therapeutic intervention, and that systematic psychological torture could cause damage that was as severe and lasting as physical abuse. The house on Willowbrook Lane is gone now, replaced by a small park where children play on swings and slides, their laughter echoing across the space where 17 souls once learned to fear their own reflections. The roses that Margaret tended so carefully have been replaced by wildflowers that grow without careful cultivation, without control, without the need to appear perfect for observing eyes. But the mirrors remain, in a sense. They exist in the memories of survivors who still struggle to look at themselves without hearing Margaret's voice whispering that they are broken, unwanted, lucky to be tolerated. They exist in the reflective surfaces that line our daily lives: bathroom mirrors, store windows, the black screens of our phones, constant reminders that the most insidious abuse often comes disguised as love. The Hallowick case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like pillars of the community, respected members of society who win awards for their kindness and dedication to helping others. Sometimes they live in beautiful houses with rose gardens and welcome mats. Houses that everyone drives past and thinks, what a lovely family must live there. The 17 children who survived the house on Willowbrook Lane teach us that healing is possible, but it requires tremendous courage to face not just the trauma of what happened to them, but the deeper trauma of learning to see themselves as worthy of love and respect. Some of them are still learning. Some of them may always be learning. Margaret Hallowick remains in prison, where she has become a model inmate, helping other prisoners with their psychological issues and leading group therapy sessions. She has never acknowledged wrongdoing, maintaining that her techniques were innovative therapeutic interventions designed to help damaged children. Even behind bars, she continues to see herself as a misunderstood pioneer in child psychology. The mirrors in her cell are made of polished metal, secured to the wall with rivets that cannot be removed. She sees her reflection every day, and unlike the children she tortured, she apparently has no problem looking at what she sees there. Some houses don't remember joy. They only echo control. But sometimes, if we're very lucky, we tear those houses down and plant wildflowers in their place, letting something beautiful grow without the need for perfection. without the need for mirrors to tell us who we are. Subscribe to the Creepy Journal for more stories they tried to forget, and we refuse to. Because some truths are too important to remain buried, even when they disturb our sleep and make us question the safety of the world we think we know.